Right now, space agencies around the world are spending billions of dollars designing lunar habitats they believe will house humanity's first permanent off-world settlement. They are wrong, not because of budget constraints or political will, not because we lack the rockets or the ambition. They are wrong because of a fundamental engineering truth that no amount of innovation can overcome. Every closed-loop life support system ever built degrades faster than it can be repaired. On Earth, we solve this by opening windows, importing spare parts, and calling technicians. On the Moon, 239,000 miles from the nearest supply chain, surrounded by vacuum and bathed in radiation, there is no margin for error. The machines that keep you alive will eventually fail, and when they do, so will you. If you're ready to understand why humanity's dream of a lunar home faces an insurmountable engineering barrier, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, get yourself comfortable. Let's begin. The moon has haunted human imagination since the first hunter-gatherer tilted their heads skyward and wondered what that pale disk actually was. For millennia, it represented the unreachable, the boundary between earth and heaven, the domain of gods and myth. Ancient civilizations tracked its phases to plant crops and mark festivals. Poets wrote verses about its cold beauty. Scientists squinted through primitive telescopes and sketched its craters without knowing what had made them. Then everything changed. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong pressed his boot into lunar regolith, and the unreachable became a destination. The moment felt like the beginning of something inevitable. Surely, we thought, permanent settlement would follow within a generation. We would build bases, then outposts, then cities. Our grandchildren would be born under the black lunar sky, gazing up at the blue marble of Earth the way we gaze at the moon. More than 50 years later, we have not returned. The last human bootprint on the moon was made in December 1972, when Eugene Cernan climbed back into the lunar module and left behind a world that has remained untouched by human hands ever since. The footprints are still there, the flags still stand, the silence remains unbroken, but that silence is about to end. Plans call for a lunar gateway space station to serve as a waypoint for surface missions. The European Space Agency, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency are all contributing modules and expertise. Meanwhile, China's National Space Administration has announced its own lunar ambitions. The Chang'e program has already landed rovers and returned samples. Chinese officials speak openly of permanent lunar bases and the establishment of research stations at the lunar South Pole. They are not bluffing. Their track record of meeting space exploration milestones suggests they have the capability to deliver. Private companies have joined the race. SpaceX's Starship, designed to carry 100 passengers to Mars, dozens of smaller companies are working on everything from spacesuits to habitat modules to mining equipment. Billions of dollars flow into blueprints showing pressurized modules connected by tunnels, hydroponic gardens bathed in artificial sunlight, and astronauts gazing through windows at Earth hanging in the black sky. The promotional materials promise a new chapter in human history. A species that evolved on one world will finally become a multi-world civilization. The moon will be our stepping stone to the stars. The engineers designing these habitats are among the most brilliant minds in aerospace. They have solved problems that seemed impossible just decades ago. They have landed robots on comets traveling at 40,000 miles per hour. They have photographed the shadow of a black hole 27 million trillion miles away. They have kept humans alive in low Earth orbit continuously for over 2 decades. These are not dreamers, disconnected from reality. These are people who bend physics to human will through mathematics and materials and meticulous planning. But there is a problem they cannot solve. Not because they lack intelligence or resources or determination, because the problem is unsolvable. Every plan for permanent lunar habitation depends on closed-loop life support systems. These are the machines that recycle your air, purify your water, regulate your temperature, and manage your waste. They are the artificial ecosystem that keeps you alive in an environment that would kill you in seconds without protection. On the International Space Station, these systems work reasonably well. The station orbits just 400 kilometers above Earth, close enough that the planet fills half the sky through every window. When filters clog, pumps fail, or contamination builds up, resupply missions arrive within days. Cargo vehicles launch from Florida, Kazakhstan, and Japan, carrying spare parts, fresh supplies, and replacement equipment. Broken components get swapped out, critical systems get upgraded, the pipeline never stops. The moon is not 400 kilometers away. It is 384,000 kilometers away, nearly 1,000 times farther than the space station. A resupply mission takes 3 days at minimum, and that assumes a rocket is already on the launch pad, fully fueled, ready to fly at a moment's notice. In reality, no such rocket exists. Emergency resupply would take weeks to prepare, more likely months, and that assumes Earth-based infrastructure is functioning perfectly, which it often is not. This distance changes everything. On the moon, your closed-loop systems cannot fail. There is no backup waiting in a warehouse. There is no opening the window for fresh air because there is no air outside. There is no driving to the store for a replacement part because the nearest store is 250,000 miles away through hard vacuum. If your carbon dioxide scrubber fails at 3 in the morning, you either fix it with whatever tools and materials you have on hand, or you suffocate. This is not hyperbole. This is not pessimism. This is the engineering reality that every lunar habitat designer confronts when they sit down to work through the numbers. Here is what they are discovering. Closed-loop life support systems degrade faster than they can be maintained. This is not a temporary engineering challenge that will yield to clever design. It is a fundamental characteristic of complex mechanical and chemical systems operating in hostile environments. And the moon is perhaps the most hostile environment humans have ever seriously attempted to inhabit. Let us examine exactly what makes the lunar environment so punishing. First, there is the vacuum. The moon has no atmosphere to speak of. Technically, there are trace amounts of gas clinging to the surface, atoms of helium and argon released by radioactive decay in the rocks, hydrogen and oxygen from solar-wind interactions. But for any practical purpose, the surface pressure is 0, approximately 3 times 10 to the negative 15th atmospheres. If you tried to breathe it, there would be nothing to breathe. Your lungs would be empty. The air in your body would rush outward, seeking the equilibrium of nothingness. Any habitat must maintain an internal pressure differential of roughly 1 atmosphere against this void. That is 14.7 pounds per square inch, pushing outward against every surface, against every seal, every joint, every window, every hatch, every penetration where wires or pipes pass through the hull, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year, decade after decade. Materials fatigue under constant stress. Metals develop microscopic cracks. Polymers lose their elasticity. Seals that were perfectly flush when installed begin to separate as the substrates shift imperceptibly. The vacuum never rests. It never takes a break. It never forgives a moment of weakness. It is always there, pulling at every boundary between life and death, waiting for the inevitable failure. Second, there are the temperature extremes. Without an atmosphere to distribute heat, the lunar surface experiences temperature swings that would destroy most Earth-based machinery within weeks. During the 2-week lunar day, when the sun beats down on the regolith without any atmospheric filtering, surface temperatures can reach 127 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to boil water, hot enough to soften certain plastics, hot enough to cause significant thermal expansion in metal structures. Then comes the 2-week lunar night. With no atmosphere to retain heat, temperatures plunge to negative 173 degrees Celsius, colder than any place on Earth, colder than the surface of Mars, cold enough to make steel brittle, cold enough to crack glass, cold enough to freeze lubricants solid. That is a swing of 300 degrees Celsius every 29 days. Every single lunar month, every component of a habitat experiences this brutal thermal cycling. Materials expand as they heat and contract as they cool. Different materials expand and contract at different rates. A seal made of silicone rubber pressed against an aluminum frame will experience differential thermal movement. The contact pressure changes. Microscopic gaps open and close. Over hundreds of cycles, the seal material work hardens. It loses flexibility. It develops permanent set, no longer returning fully to its original shape. Eventually, it cracks. The crack may be invisible to the naked eye, but gas molecules are very small. They find a way through. No material known to engineering can withstand this cycling indefinitely without degradation. Specialized alloys perform better than common metals. Advanced polymers outlast rubber. Ceramic composites resist temperature changes better than most alternatives. But all of them degrade. All of them fatigue. All of them eventually fail. Third, there is the radiation. Earth's magnetic field extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space, deflecting charged particles from the solar wind and trapping them in radiation belts far above the atmosphere. The atmosphere itself absorbs most cosmic radiation, converting high-energy particles into harmless cascades of lower-energy interactions. By the time radiation reaches the surface where humans live, it has been filtered through multiple protective layers that evolved over billions of years. The Moon has neither protection. Its magnetic field is essentially non-existent, a remnant from a molten core that solidified billions of years ago. Its atmosphere is a vacuum. Every charged particle from the Sun, every cosmic ray from distant supernovae, every burst of radiation from solar flares reaches the surface unimpeded. Galactic cosmic rays are particularly insidious. These are atomic nuclei, often iron or heavier elements, accelerated to nearly the speed of light by processes that occur across the galaxy. They carry tremendous energy. When they strike material, they do not simply stop. They penetrate deep, causing cascades of secondary radiation as they interact with atoms in their path. Shielding against them is difficult, because the shielding itself becomes a source of secondary particles. Solar particle events present acute risks. When the Sun erupts in a coronal mass ejection, it can release enormous quantities of high-energy protons that reach the Moon within minutes to hours. A major event could deliver a lethal radiation dose to unprotected astronauts within hours. Habitat shielding can reduce exposure. Water, polyethylene, and lunar regolith all provide some protection, but no practical shielding can block everything. Some radiation penetrates, and the radiation that does penetrate does cumulative damage to both human tissue and electronic systems. Human cells can repair some radiation damage, but not all. The repairs are imperfect. Errors accumulate. Cancer risk rises with total dose. Cataracts develop. Cardiovascular disease becomes more likely. The central nervous system may be affected in ways we do not fully understand. Electronic systems fare no better. Radiation causes bit flips in memory chips, corrupting data. It degrades semiconductor junctions, increasing resistance and reducing performance. It damages solar cells, reducing power generation over time. The computers running your life support become less reliable precisely when you need them most. But perhaps the most insidious threat comes from something the Apollo astronauts discovered firsthand: lunar regolith. When we say regolith, we mean the layer of loose material covering the lunar surface. On Earth, we would call it soil, but that word implies biological processes that have never occurred on the Moon. Lunar regolith is not soil, it is pulverized rock, the accumulated debris of 4 billion years of meteorite impacts. Earth's soil has been weathered by water, wind, and biological activity over eons. Rain dissolves sharp edges. Wind tumbles particles against each other, rounding them. Plant roots break down minerals into gentler forms. The grains in a handful of beach sand have been smoothed by processes that never existed on the Moon. Lunar regolith has experienced no weathering whatsoever. Every particle was created by violent impact. The edges are sharp. The surfaces are jagged. Under an electron microscope, the particles look like shattered glass, because that is essentially what they are, micrometeorites striking the lunar surface at tens of kilometers per second, generate temperatures hot enough to melt rock. The molten droplets solidify instantly in the vacuum, creating glass spheres and angular fragments with razor-sharp edges. The particles also carry electrical charge. Without an atmosphere to provide conductivity, the lunar surface becomes electrostatically charged by solar wind and ultraviolet radiation. The dust particles cling to surfaces with surprising tenacity. They do not simply brush off. They adhere through electrostatic attraction, requiring significant effort to remove. During the Apollo missions, astronauts discovered that this dust got everywhere. It clung to spacesuits despite rigorous cleaning protocols. It infiltrated the lunar module through the airlock. It scratched helmet visors, degrading visibility. It jammed mechanisms that had worked perfectly in Earth tests. It irritated eyes and respiratory systems, despite the short duration of surface activities. Harrison Schmitt, the Apollo 17 lunar module pilot and the only professional geologist to walk on the Moon, experienced what he described as hay fever symptoms after exposure to lunar dust inside the spacecraft. His nasal passages became congested. His eyes watered. He was reacting to material that no human immune system had ever encountered before. Subsequent analysis revealed why. Lunar regolith contains nanoscale particles of silica glass that can penetrate deep into lung tissue, far deeper than the larger particles that human respiratory systems evolved to handle. Unlike Earth dust, which our bodies have encountered for millions of years, these particles trigger severe inflammatory responses. Extended exposure could cause a condition similar to silicosis, the lung disease that killed generations of coal miners and stone workers. The particles also contain iron and titanium oxides that generate reactive oxygen species when they contact biological tissue. These free radicals damage cell membranes and DNA. In plain language, lunar dust is chemically toxic. It does not just irritate, it actively harms. This dust will infiltrate any habitat, no matter how carefully designed. Every time an airlock cycles, some dust enters. The outer door opens, exposing the chamber to the lunar environment. Dust settles on surfaces. The outer door closes, the inner door opens, and the crew member enters the habitat. Some of that dust comes with them, on their suits, on their tools, on the equipment they are bringing inside. Every time a spacesuit returns from the surface, it carries dust. The fabric is impregnated with particles. The joints are contaminated. The seals are compromised. Cleaning protocols can remove the bulk of the material, but not the finest particles, not the ones measured in micrometers and nanometers. Over months and years, this dust accumulates inside the habitat. It clogs air filters faster than anticipated. It contaminates water recycling systems, introducing abrasive particles into pumps and membranes. It infiltrates electronics, causing shorts and degrading connections. It abrades seals and mechanisms designed for cleaner environments. There is no perfect seal against particles measured in micrometers. Industrial cleanrooms on Earth achieve remarkable purity, but they do so through massive filtration systems and careful protocols in benign environments. A lunar habitat cannot achieve cleanroom conditions while simultaneously serving as a working facility with regular surface operations. The International Space Station does not face this problem. There is no dust in low Earth orbit. The environment is a vacuum, but it is a clean vacuum. lunar habitats will face perpetual contamination from a substance that actively works to destroy every system it contacts. Now we begin to see the fundamental challenge. A lunar habitat must maintain a perfect pressure seal against vacuum, while that vacuum constantly pulls at every boundary. It must manage 300-degree temperature swings that fatigue materials and stress seals with every cycle. It must shield against cumulative radiation damage that degrades both human health and electronic systems over time. And it must prevent microscopic toxic particles from gradually destroying every system inside it while conducting the surface operations that are the entire point of being there. Any one of these challenges would be daunting. Together, they create an environment where mechanical systems degrade far faster than they would on Earth, or even in Earth orbit. This brings us to the core problem: closed-loop habitation collapse. A closed-loop life support system is one that recycles its inputs. Water is purified and reused rather than discarded. Air is scrubbed of carbon dioxide and replenished with oxygen rather than vented and replaced. Waste is processed and converted into usable resources rather than simply stored. The goal is to minimize the need for resupply from Earth, because resupply is expensive, slow, and potentially unreliable. The engineering principle is sound. On paper, the mathematics work beautifully. You calculate the mass of consumables a crew needs per day. You calculate the efficiency of recycling systems. You determine the equilibrium point where outputs balance inputs. Everything closes into a neat loop that sustains itself indefinitely. But here is what the mathematics do not fully capture. Every recycling process is imperfect. Every filter lets something through. Every chemical reaction produces trace byproducts. Every mechanical component wears slightly with each cycle. Consider air recycling. The primary function is to remove carbon dioxide produced by human respiration and regenerate breathable oxygen. The current gold standard is the Sabatier process, which combines carbon dioxide with hydrogen to produce methane and water. The water can then be electrolyzed to produce oxygen and hydrogen, with the hydrogen recycled back into the process. On paper, this cycle closes perfectly. Carbon dioxide goes in, oxygen comes out, and the only byproduct is methane, which can be vented or stored for potential fuel use. In practice, nothing is perfect. The Sabatier reaction requires catalysts, typically nickel or ruthenium, that degrade over time. The catalyst surfaces become poisoned by trace contaminants. Efficiency drops, the reaction temperature must be increased to maintain output, which accelerates degradation. The electrolysis cells corrode. The electrodes accumulate mineral deposits. The membranes separating hydrogen and oxygen develop microscopic holes that allow cross-contamination. Efficiency drops, power consumption rises. Trace contaminants from human metabolism, from off-gassing materials, from the lunar dust that inevitably enters the system, accumulate in the chemical loops. Volatile organic compounds, ammonia from sweat, sulfur compounds from digestion, formaldehyde from construction materials. These contaminants poison catalysts, foul membranes, and reduce efficiency. Over months and years, the air recycling system produces less oxygen per cycle. It requires more maintenance. Components must be replaced more frequently. Eventually, if not maintained with increasing intensity, it fails. Water recycling faces analogous challenges. The system must remove organic compounds, dissolved solids, and biological contaminants from wastewater. Current technology uses a combination of filtration, distillation, and chemical treatment. Each step removes most but not all contaminants. The residue accumulates. Biofilms grow in pipes and reservoirs despite antimicrobial treatments. These microbial communities are remarkably resilient. They adapt to their environment. They find niches where they can survive. Over time, they compromise system performance. Minerals precipitate out of solution and clog mechanisms. Calcium, magnesium, and other dissolved solids concentrate as water cycles through the system. They deposit on heating elements, reducing efficiency. They coat membranes, reducing permeability. On the ISS, these systems require constant maintenance and periodic replacement of major components. Astronauts spend hours each week keeping life support operational. When a component fails beyond repair, it is replaced with a new one launched from Earth. The average delivery time is a few weeks, sometimes less if urgent priority is assigned. On the Moon, you cannot wait a few weeks for a replacement carbon dioxide scrubber. The proposed solution is to bring spare parts. Lots of spare parts. Design redundancy into every critical system. Train crew members to repair and rebuild equipment on site. All of this helps. None of it solves the fundamental problem. Because here is the mathematical reality. You cannot bring infinite spare parts. A cargo mission to the Moon might deliver several tons of supplies. Some of that mass is food and water. What remains for spare parts is limited. You cannot anticipate every failure mode. Systems fail in ways that designers never imagined. Combinations of factors create novel problems. The environment attacks from angles that testing did not predict. You cannot repair systems that have degraded beyond your available materials and tools. A pump with a worn bearing can be rebuilt if you have replacement bearings. But what if the pump housing has cracked? What if the motor windings have degraded from radiation? What if the seals have taken a set from thermal cycling that no available replacement can match? And every repair you make introduces new potential points of failure. Replace a seal, and you might misalign the joint. Swap a filter, and you might introduce contamination during the process. Fix a pump, and you might stress an adjacent component. Repair work itself is a source of new problems. This is not a failure of engineering competence. It is thermodynamics. Complex systems degrade toward disorder. Organization breaks down into chaos. Structure decays into randomness. On Earth, we combat entropy by importing energy and materials from outside the system. We call technicians from other companies. We order parts from manufacturers on other continents. We rebuild from scratch when repair is no longer practical. We have access to an entire planetary industrial civilization backing every repair effort. On the Moon, you are the technician. Your spare parts are what you brought with you, or what you can fabricate from local materials using equipment that is itself degrading. Rebuilding from scratch means processing lunar regolith with mining equipment that wears out, refining equipment that corrodes, manufacturing equipment that drifts out of calibration. The system is closed not by choice but by physics. And closed systems collapse. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means for lunar habitation plans. The current Artemis program envisions surface stays of days to weeks, building toward extended presence. For short durations, you can bring everything you need and leave before the systems degrade significantly. The consumables last. The filters hold. The seals maintain integrity. You accomplish your mission and return home before entropy catches up. Extended missions measured in months become more challenging but remain possible with sufficient investment. Bring more supplies, bring more spares, bring more redundancy. Accept higher costs and greater risk. Human presence on the Moon for the duration of a research campaign is within reach, but the dream of permanent habitation, of lunar cities with generations born and living their entire lives on the Moon, is fundamentally different. That dream requires closed-loop systems to function reliably, not for months but for decades. Not to function perfectly, just to function well enough to keep everyone alive through every challenge. Based on everything we know about materials science, chemistry, system engineering, and the behavior of complex systems in hostile environments, this is not achievable. Not with current technology, not with any foreseeable technology, not without violating principles that are as fundamental as the laws of thermodynamics themselves. This brings us back to the real problem that every discussion of lunar challenges ultimately collapses into. You can address individual challenges with increasing sophistication. You can develop better dust mitigation strategies using electrostatic repulsion, magnetic separation, and improved airlock protocols. You can design more robust thermal management systems with advanced insulation and active temperature control. You can improve radiation shielding with optimized materials and protective protocols. Each of these advances helps. Each of these extends the operational lifetime of systems. None of them changes the fundamental equation. Because at the end of every engineering day, you still have a closed system. Air recycling still accumulates contaminants despite your best filtration. Water purification still builds up residue despite your best treatment. Seals still degrade despite your best materials. Filters still clog despite your best maintenance. Spare parts still run out despite your best planning. And the people inside the habitat still need those systems to work. Some advocates argue that we can solve this through in situ resource utilization, mining oxygen from regolith, extracting water from polar ice, processing local materials into spare parts. This approach could extend the lifetime of a lunar outpost and reduce dependence on Earth resupply. The mining equipment wears against abrasive regolith. The processing facilities require maintenance. The electronics controlling everything succumb to radiation damage. You have not escaped the closed loop. You have just made it larger and more complex. And there is a darker truth lurking beneath these engineering challenges. The moon itself actively works against habitation. It is not a passive environment, waiting to be tamed by human ingenuity. It is an aggressive one that attacks your equipment continuously. The dust infiltrates despite every precaution. The temperature swings fatigue every material. The radiation accumulates in every system. The vacuum pulls at every seal. Every single day your habitat survives on the moon, it loses ground to entropy. This is why every serious lunar habitat study eventually confronts the same uncomfortable conclusion. Short-term presence is achievable with sufficient investment. Extended missions are challenging but possible with sufficient resources. Permanent, self-sustaining habitation is not. The moon will never be a human home, but these environmental challenges are just the beginning. Understanding why the moon will never be a human home requires examining the specific mechanisms of system failure. The seals that crack, the joints that leak, the chemistry of contamination, and the mathematics of spare part exhaustion. Each solution proposed creates new problems. The closed loop tightens around every design. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 crew members. The investigation that followed revealed a cause so mundane it seemed impossible. A rubber O-ring, smaller than a dinner plate, had failed to seal properly in the cold January temperatures. Hot combustion gases, channeled through the resulting gap, burned through the external tank attachment and triggered the structural failure that destroyed the vehicle. 7 people died because a rubber ring got stiff in the cold. This tragedy contains a lesson that every lunar habitat designer must internalize. Seals are simultaneously the most critical and most vulnerable components in any pressurized system. They are the boundary between life and death. They are also, by their very nature, destined to fail. The Challenger O-ring was designed for conditions far less demanding than the lunar surface. It operated in Earth's atmosphere, with a temperature differential measured in tens of degrees. It experienced pressure cycles measured in minutes rather than weeks. It needed to function for the duration of a launch, not for decades of continuous operation. On the moon, seals face an entirely different order of challenge. A permanent lunar habitat requires hundreds of seals, perhaps thousands, depending on the design complexity. Every hatch needs seals. Every window needs seals. Every pipe penetrating the pressure hull needs seals. Every electrical conduit, every structural joint, every connection between modules requires a barrier that maintains atmospheric integrity against the vacuum outside. Each of these seals must perform perfectly, continuously, for years. A 99% success rate sounds impressive until you realize that 1% of 1,000 seals is 10 failures, 10 potential breaches, 10 opportunities for the vacuum to find a way inside. Consider what thermal cycling actually does to seal materials at the molecular level. When you heat a polymer, its long molecular chains gain energy. In some cases, the softening causes the seal to extrude under pressure, squeezing out of its groove. When you cool that same polymer to negative 173 degrees Celsius, the chains lose energy. They contract and stiffen. The seal shrinks, potentially pulling away from the surfaces it must protect. Microscopic gaps open. This expansion and contraction would be manageable if it happened once. But as we established earlier, the lunar thermal cycle repeats every 29 days. Cycle after cycle, year after year, the mechanical stress accumulates. Materials scientists call this thermal fatigue. Each cycle does incremental damage. Molecular structures develop microscopic cracks. The cracks propagate with subsequent cycles. Eventually, the accumulated damage reaches a threshold where the material fails, or more insidiously, begins leaking through a network of microfractures invisible to inspection. Different seal materials respond differently to thermal cycling. Fluoropolymers like PTFE resist chemical degradation but can cold flow under pressure. Metal seals made from soft alloys like indium can conform well to surfaces but deform permanently after repeated cycles. Engineers have spent decades developing materials optimized for space applications. The seals on the International Space Station represent the current state of the art. They work well in low Earth orbit, where the station's thermal control systems maintain relatively stable temperatures and where replacement seals can be delivered within weeks if problems develop. Those seals have not been tested under lunar conditions for extended periods. No seal has. The 300-degree thermal swing, the 29-day cycle duration, the abrasive dust contamination, the accumulated radiation exposure. This combination of stresses has never been applied to any seal system for the years or decades that permanent habitation would require. Laboratory testing can simulate individual stress factors. Thermal vacuum chambers can cycle materials through temperature extremes. Radiation facilities can expose samples to simulated cosmic ray flux. Regolith simulants can test abrasion resistance. But replicating all of these factors simultaneously, over realistic timescales, exceeds current testing capabilities. We are proposing to bet human lives on materials whose long-term behavior in the lunar environment remains genuinely unknown. The mathematics of seal reliability illuminate the scale of this gamble. Consider a habitat with 1,000 critical seals. Assume each seal has a 99.99% probability of surviving any given year. An extraordinarily optimistic assumption for seals experiencing continuous thermal cycling, vacuum stress, and dust contamination. After 1 year, the probability that all 1,000 seals have survived is approximately 90%. After 10 years, the probability drops to 37%. After 25 years, it falls below 10%. These numbers assume no common mode failures, no manufacturing defects, no unexpected environmental stresses. The reality would likely be worse. The response to this challenge is redundancy. If one seal fails, have a backup. Design pressure boundaries with multiple sealing surfaces. Create compartmentalized volumes so that a breach in one area does not compromise the entire habitat. Redundancy is sound engineering practice. It is also a trap. Every redundant seal is an additional seal that can fail. Doubling the seals doubles the number of potential failure points. The probability of any single seal failing actually increases with redundancy, even as the probability of catastrophic pressure loss decreases. More importantly, redundancy adds complexity. The interfaces between redundant systems require their own seals. The monitoring systems that detect failures require their own maintenance. The procedures for responding to partial failures require training and practice. The habitat becomes larger, heavier, more expensive, and more difficult to maintain. At some point, the complexity required to achieve redundancy exceeds the complexity that a small crew can effectively manage. You have traded one form of risk for another. Beyond static seals, every mechanical system in a lunar habitat contains dynamic components that present their own failure modes. Consider a pressure hatch the door that separates the habitable interior from the vacuum outside or from adjacent pressurized volumes. A seemingly simple device, but examine what it must accomplish. The hatch must seal tightly when closed. The seal must conform to the frame despite manufacturing tolerances, despite thermal distortion, despite the accumulation of dust and debris on sealing surfaces. The seal must maintain integrity across the full range of pressure differentials it might experience. The hatch must open and close reliably. The hinge mechanism must operate smoothly despite vacuum conditions that preclude liquid lubricants. The latching mechanism must engage securely every time, without binding, jamming, or incomplete closure. The actuation system, whether manual or powered, must function across the full temperature range. Each component in this assembly is a potential failure point. Hinge pins wear against their bushings. In vacuum, without the lubricating films that normally form in atmosphere, metal-on-metal contact accelerates wear. Galling occurs microscopic welding between surfaces that tears material away when the joint moves. After enough cycles, the hinge binds. Latch mechanisms accumulate contamination. Lunar dust, carried in by crew members and equipment, works its way into every crevice. The angular, abrasive particles jam between moving parts. They scratch bearing surfaces. They accumulate in quantities that eventually impede movement. Seal surfaces become damaged through use. Every time the hatch closes, the seal contacts the frame. Every contact is an opportunity for damage. A piece of debris on the sealing surface can scratch a groove that compromises future sealing. Repeated contact in the same location can create wear patterns that progressively degrade performance. On the International Space Station, astronauts report that hatch mechanisms require regular attention. Some hatches have become stiff or temperamental over the station's 2-decade lifetime. This is with regular maintenance, with lubricants formulated for space conditions, with the ability to launch replacement components when necessary. On the Moon, replacement hatches cannot be launched on short notice. The hatches you install are the hatches you will live with for years, possibly decades. If a hatch mechanism degrades to the point of unreliability, your options are limited to whatever repair capabilities exist on site. The same principles apply to every mechanical system in the habitat. Pumps, valves, actuators, motors, fans, each contains components that wear with use. Each operates in an environment that accelerates that wear. Each becomes less reliable over time. The contamination challenge illustrates how closed-loop systems fail through accumulation rather than catastrophe. The air inside a habitat carries more than the carbon dioxide and water vapor that recycling systems are designed to handle. Human metabolism produces acetone, isoprene, alcohols, aldehydes, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide. The specific mix varying with diet, health, and stress level. The habitat itself contributes volatile compounds off-gassing from plastics, adhesives, and coatings. Electronics produce ozone. Cleaning agents leave residues. Activated carbon filters absorb organic compounds but have finite capacity. Once saturated, they cease functioning and can begin releasing captured contaminants back into the atmosphere if conditions change. Catalytic oxidizers destroy certain organics, but are poisoned by silicones, halogens, and heavy metals. Once poisoned, the catalyst must be replaced with components that may not be available. Particulate filters capture airborne particles, but the finest particles pass through. These particles can remain suspended in the habitat atmosphere for extended periods, available to be inhaled with every breath. On the ISS, air quality management requires constant vigilance. The station has experienced episodes of elevated carbon monoxide, ammonia, and formaldehyde. Specialized sensors monitor dozens of compounds. Filters are replaced on strict schedules. Unusual readings trigger immediate investigation. Even with this attention, the station's atmosphere is measurably different from fresh outdoor air on Earth. Astronauts report that the smell of the station is distinctive, a combination of machine oil, plastic, and the indefinable odor of a closed environment. Some crew members experience headaches and nasal congestion, symptoms associated with poor indoor air quality on Earth. In a lunar habitat, air quality challenges would be amplified. The crew cannot step outside for fresh air. They cannot open windows. Every breath they take comes from the same recycling system, carrying whatever contaminants that system fails to remove. Long-term exposure to elevated contaminant levels creates health risks that are difficult to predict. On Earth, sick building syndrome causes a constellation of symptoms: headache, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, respiratory irritation that resolve when occupants leave the building. On the Moon, there is nowhere else to go. Water recycling presents an equally complex contamination challenge. The water recovery systems on the ISS process urine, humidity condensate, and wastewater into potable water. The process involves filtration to remove particles, distillation to separate pure water from dissolved solids, and catalytic oxidation to destroy organic compounds. The system achieves recovery rates exceeding 90%. That remaining fraction represents water lost to the system, but also contaminants concentrated by the process. Minerals dissolved in the input. Water become increasingly concentrated in the brine that remains after distillation. Organic compounds resistant to oxidation accumulate. Biofilms form on surfaces. Despite antimicrobial treatments, the ISS water system requires regular maintenance to address these accumulations. Distillation assemblies are periodically replaced as scale buildup reduces efficiency. Filter beds are swapped when breakthrough occurs. The entire system has undergone major overhauls multiple times during the station's operational lifetime. A lunar habitat water system would face the same maintenance requirements with fewer options for addressing them. Replacement components must either be imported from Earth or manufactured locally. The concentrated waste that accumulates must be stored somehow, representing a growing inventory of potentially hazardous material. In situ water production from lunar ice is often proposed as a supplement to recycling. Permanently shadowed craters near the lunar poles are believed to contain significant water ice deposits. Mining this ice could provide a local water source and reduce dependence on perfect recycling efficiency. The permanently shadowed regions where ice accumulates are among the most hostile locations in the solar system. Temperatures approach -250 degrees Celsius colder than the surface of Pluto. Equipment operating in these conditions experiences thermal stress, unlike anything faced by machines designed for Earth or even typical lunar surface operations. Lubricants that remain fluid at lunar day temperatures become rigid solids. Metals that flex under normal conditions become brittle. Electronics designed for the 300-degree cycling of the general lunar surface face an entirely different thermal regime in eternal shadow. The ice itself is not pure water waiting to be collected. It is mixed with regolith, bound to mineral surfaces, potentially contaminated with volatile compounds accumulated over billions of years. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and more exotic species. Processing this material into potable water requires not just extraction but purification. all performed by equipment subject to the same degradation that affects every lunar system. The equipment that mines and processes lunar ice is itself subject to degradation. Drilling mechanisms wear against frozen regolith harder than concrete. Processing systems clog with the contaminants they are designed to remove. The same closed-loop problem applies. You need equipment to maintain your equipment, and it all degrades together. This brings us to spare parts exhaustion. For a permanent habitat, the calculation reveals a paradox. Every spare part you bring is mass that could have been life support consumables, scientific equipment, or crew supplies. But every spare part you do not bring is a potential single point of failure waiting to end the mission. Worse, the spare parts themselves degrade in storage, seals age, lubricants separate, electronics accumulate radiation damage. The parts you brought for Year 10 may not function when Year 10 arrives. The solution proposed is manufacturing. Produce spare parts locally using fabrication equipment. This reduces the need to import finished components from Earth. But fabrication requires raw materials. Some can be extracted from lunar resources. Aluminum, titanium, and iron are present in lunar regolith. But extracting and refining these materials requires industrial processes that themselves need equipment and consumables. Modern manufacturing also relies on materials that are rare or absent on the Moon. Specialized alloys require specific elemental compositions. Electronic components need rare earth elements. Lubricants require specific chemical formulations. The more sophisticated your manufacturing capability, the more inputs it requires. There is also the knowledge problem. Modern industrial equipment is produced through complex supply chains involving thousands of specialized components from hundreds of different suppliers. Replicating this capability on the Moon would require not just equipment but expertise across a vast range of disciplines. A lunar habitat crew, no matter how well trained, cannot master every specialty required to manufacture everything they might need. The result is that lunar manufacturing, while helpful, cannot achieve true self-sufficiency. The closed loop remains dependent on inputs from Earth. Specialized materials, precision components, software updates, expert consultation reduce the dependence, and you extend the habitat's autonomous operation. Eliminate the dependence entirely, and you face manufacturing challenges that dwarf anything attempted in human history. This is the maintenance paradox at the heart of lunar habitation. The tools you need to maintain your systems themselves require maintenance. Every layer of redundancy requires its own support infrastructure. Eventually, you run out of layers. All of this brings us back to the real problem that makes permanent lunar habitation impossible. Closed-loop habitation systems degrade faster than they can be maintained. Every seal, every joint, every filter, every mechanism in a lunar habitat is fighting entropy. The thermal cycling fatigues materials. The radiation damages electronics. The dust infiltrates mechanisms. The vacuum stresses pressure boundaries. The chemical processes accumulate contaminants. Everything degrades. Maintenance can slow this degradation. Redundancy can provide backup when primary systems fail. Manufacturing can replace worn components, but the rate of degradation exceeds the sustainable rate of repair. Eventually, systems fail faster than they can be fixed. This is not pessimism, it is mathematics. Complex systems in hostile environments follow predictable degradation curves. On Earth, we prevent catastrophic system failure by replacing entire systems or structures. When degradation reaches critical levels, we demolish old buildings and construct new ones. We retire old aircraft and build modern replacements. We do not expect any structure to last forever. On the Moon, you cannot demolish your habitat and build a new one. The construction capability does not exist locally. The crew has nowhere else to go during construction. You are committed to the systems you have. degrading as they are. Some argue that modular design can solve this problem. Build the habitat from replaceable modules. When a module degrades beyond repair, detach it and connect a replacement launched from Earth. This approach has merit for extending habitat lifetime, but it remains dependent on a continuous supply chain from Earth. The modules themselves degrade. The interfaces between modules accumulate wear. The problem is postponed, not solved. The engineering challenge of lunar habitation is not finding solutions to individual problems. Clever engineers can address dust, thermal cycling, radiation, and contamination with various degrees of success. The challenge is that all of these problems occur simultaneously, and all of their solutions require closed-loop systems that themselves degrade. Every component of the habitat exists within a web of dependencies. The air recycling needs power. The power generation needs thermal management. The thermal management needs pumps and coolant. The pumps need seals and motors. The motors need electronics. The electronics need radiation shielding. The shielding needs structural support. The structure needs seals and joints. Pull on any thread, and the entire web moves. A failure in one system stresses adjacent systems. The crew must prioritize repairs, but every repair takes time and resources away from other maintenance. Gradually, the maintenance backlog grows. Eventually, something critical fails. This is how closed-loop systems collapse. Not through a single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of minor degradations until the system passes a threshold from which it cannot recover. But it is not just machines that degrade in a closed lunar habitat. The people inside face their own deterioration, radiation accumulating in their tissues, medical emergencies with no evacuation option, psychological pressures that compound every engineering challenge. The humans are both the reason for the habitat and, ultimately, the factor that makes its permanent operation impossible. In 1991, 8 researchers walked through an airlock and sealed themselves inside Biosphere 2, a 3.14-acre enclosed ecological system rising from the Arizona desert like a greenhouse cathedral. The structure contained a miniature rainforest, a coral reef, a savanna, a marsh, agricultural land, and a human habitat. 5,000 species of plants and animals had been carefully selected to create a self-sustaining ecosystem. The air would be recycled by plants. The water would be purified by natural processes. Food would be grown inside. Everything needed to sustain human life would be produced within the sealed boundary. This was practice for space colonization. If humans could live independently within this glass-walled paradise surrounded by breathable Arizona air, they could surely learn to live on the Moon or Mars. Within 16 months, the experiment collapsed. Oxygen levels dropped from 21% to 14%, the equivalent of living at an altitude of 13,000 feet, higher than most mountain base camps. Researchers experienced fatigue, sleep apnea, and cognitive impairment. External intervention was required to pump additional oxygen into the structure, breaking the closed loop that was supposed to demonstrate self-sufficiency. Food production fell short of requirements. Crops failed to yield as planned. The researchers lost an average of 16% of their body weight. Hunger became a constant companion, but perhaps the most devastating failure was human. The crew of 8 fractured into 2 hostile factions that refused to speak to each other. Scientific collaboration disintegrated. The psychological strain of confinement, of constant contact with the same small group, of watching their carefully planned world fail around them, proved more severe than anyone had anticipated. The system that looked viable on paper, that seemed to work in models and projections, failed catastrophically when occupied by actual human beings. Now consider what Biosphere 2 had that a lunar habitat would not. It sat in temperate Arizona. The temperature outside was survivable. If the internal climate control failed completely, residents would be uncomfortable but not dead. A lunar habitat faces 300-degree temperature swings and vacuum. Climate control failure means death within hours. It was surrounded by breathable atmosphere. When oxygen levels dropped dangerously, technicians could pump in external air. A lunar habitat has no external air. When your oxygen generation fails, you have whatever reserves you brought and whatever time those reserves provide. It had an emergency exit. When things went wrong, researchers could walk outside. The project could be paused, problems addressed, the experiment resumed. A lunar habitat has no emergency exit. The only way out is a spacecraft that may not be available, a launch window that may not align with your emergency, a 3-day journey that you may not survive. And Biosphere 2 occupied 3 acres. Current lunar habitat designs envision pressurized volumes measured in hundreds or thousands of cubic meters, a tiny fraction of that space. 8 people in 3 acres eventually came to hate each other. What happens to 6 people in a few thousand cubic feet over years instead of months? The Biosphere 2 failure illustrated a truth that engineering calculations consistently obscure. Humans are not passive passengers in life support systems. They are active components. Their behavior affects system performance in ways that are difficult to predict and impossible to eliminate. They are simultaneously the purpose of the system and its most significant source of instability. On the Moon, human factors compound every engineering challenge we have discussed, but they also introduce entirely new categories of failure that no amount of engineering can address. Let us begin with what the lunar environment does to human bodies. Radiation exposure on the lunar surface differs fundamentally from anything humans normally experience. On Earth, the atmosphere and magnetic field combine to reduce cosmic radiation to background levels that human biology has evolved to tolerate. The occasional dental X-ray or airplane flight adds trivially to lifetime exposure. We live our lives largely unaware of the radiation that constantly bombards our planet from space, because very little of it reaches us. The Moon has no such protection. Galactic cosmic rays arrive unimpeded. These are not the relatively gentle particles that reach Earth's surface. These are atomic nuclei, often heavy elements like iron, accelerated by supernovae and other cosmic events to velocities approaching the speed of light. They carry enormous energy. When they strike biological tissue, they do not simply pass through. They ionize atoms along their path, breaking chemical bonds, damaging DNA, killing cells or leaving them mutated. Solar particle events present acute risks. When the sun erupts in a coronal mass ejection, it releases billions of tons of charged particles that race outward through the solar system. These particles can reach the Moon within minutes to hours of a major flare. Without warning, radiation levels can spike to doses that cause acute radiation syndrome, nausea, immune suppression, and at extreme levels, death within days. Habitat shielding can reduce these exposures, but reduction is not elimination. Here is where the physics becomes troubling. When high-energy cosmic rays strike shielding material, they do not simply stop. They interact with atoms in the shield, producing cascades of secondary particles. These secondaries can include neutrons, protons, and other radiation that penetrates deeper into the habitat than the original particle would have. In some configurations, heavy metal shielding actually increases the radiation dose inside the protected volume. Hydrogen-rich materials like water and polyethylene are more effective because they produce fewer secondary particles. The most effective shielding would be several meters of lunar regolith piled over the habitat, using the Moon itself as protection. But burying a habitat under meters of rock requires construction capabilities that do not yet exist, and the buried habitat faces its own challenges with thermal management and access. For realistic near-term habitats with practical shielding masses, residents will receive continuous radiation exposure significantly higher than any population on Earth. Studies suggest lunar surface doses of approximately 60 to 80 millisieverts per year, roughly 10 to 20 times the average annual exposure on Earth, and 2 to 3 times the exposure aboard the International Space Station. These numbers translate to career limits. NASA's current standard aims to keep astronaut cancer mortality risk below 3%. At lunar radiation levels, this limit would be reached within a few years. A lunar resident who stays for a decade would accumulate doses well beyond any limits currently considered acceptable. The health consequences extend beyond cancer. Long-term radiation exposure is associated with cardiovascular disease, with cataracts, with cognitive decline. Animal studies suggest neurological effects, including memory impairment and behavioral changes. The central nervous system may be particularly vulnerable to heavy ion radiation of the type that dominates the lunar environment. We are proposing to subject humans to radiation levels and types that no human population has ever experienced for durations that exceed all prior space experience. The health consequences are genuinely uncertain because we have no data. From the limited experience of astronauts in low Earth orbit, where Earth's magnetic field provides partial protection, a permanent lunar settlement would include people who stay for years, perhaps decades. Some proposals envision children being born and raised on the Moon, spending their entire developmental period in a radiation environment for which human biology has no evolutionary preparation. These scenarios are not science fiction. They appear in serious planning documents from space agencies and private companies. The settlement that proceeds on this basis is gambling with human health against odds that cannot be calculated because the necessary data does not exist. Now consider what happens when health problems emerge in a population that cannot access Earth-based medical care. Medical isolation is a challenge that space medicine has never fully confronted because previous space missions have always had evacuation as a backstop. An astronaut on the ISS who develops appendicitis, who suffers a heart attack, who is injured in an accident, can be returned to Earth within hours. Emergency medical evacuation is expensive and disruptive, but it is possible. The return capsule is always there. From the Moon, evacuation takes days at minimum. The transit time alone is approximately 3 days, but transit requires a spacecraft to be available, fueled, and ready. It requires a launch window to align with the emergency. It requires the patient to survive the journey, the acceleration of launch, the vibration of transit, the deceleration of Earth re-entry. Many medical emergencies cannot wait 3 days. A ruptured appendix, an acute cardiac event, a traumatic injury with internal bleeding. These conditions require intervention within hours, sometimes minutes. No evacuation is fast enough. This means lunar habitats must possess medical capabilities that far exceed anything currently deployed in space. But medical capability is not simply equipment. It is training, practice, and supplies, all of which face severe constraints in the lunar environment. Consider surgery. A lunar habitat might include surgical equipment, scalpels, retractors, anesthesia apparatus, monitoring systems, but equipment alone does not create surgical capability. A surgeon maintains proficiency through practice. An Earth-based surgeon might perform hundreds of procedures per year. A lunar surgeon might perform one or none. Skills atrophy without use. The surgeon who successfully removed an appendix 5 years ago may not be capable of doing so today. Medical equipment requires maintenance and calibration. Imaging systems drift out of specification. Monitoring devices need regular verification. Sterilization systems must be maintained. The same closed-loop degradation that affects all habitat systems affects medical equipment. The CT scanner that worked perfectly when installed may produce unreliable images after years of radiation exposure and component aging. Pharmaceuticals have shelf lives. Medications degrade over time, losing potency, potentially becoming harmful. A lunar habitat cannot stock every possible medication in unlimited quantities for unlimited durations. Choices must be made about what to carry, how much, and for how long. Those choices become life or death decisions when the needed medication has expired or was never included in inventory. The closed-loop problem applies to medicine as it applies to every other habitat system. Medical supplies are consumed and must be either resupplied from Earth or manufactured locally. Equipment degrades and must be maintained with spare parts that themselves degrade. Skills atrophy without practice opportunities. The medical capability of a lunar habitat diminishes over time unless actively maintained through continual investment. But physical health is not the only concern. Psychological health may be the most underestimated challenge of long-duration lunar habitation, and the one most likely to precipitate system-wide failure. Humans evolved as social creatures living in environments with varied stimulation. Our ancestors roamed landscapes that changed with seasons. They interacted with extended family groups and neighboring bands. They experienced the full spectrum of sensory input: varied terrain, changing weather, diverse plant and animal life, the rhythms of day and night, the cycles of seasons. A lunar habitat provides none of this. The crew is confined to a small pressurized volume with the same small group of people for extended periods. Privacy is limited to whatever personal space can be carved from shared facilities. The view outside never changes. Grey regolith under black sky, the same craters, the same rocks, the same utter stillness. The Earth rises and sets on a fortnightly cycle, but beyond that, nothing in the visual environment indicates time passing or seasons changing. The daily routine is dominated by maintenance tasks and system monitoring. The exciting scientific work that motivates lunar presence must be balanced against the endless housekeeping that survival demands. Filter changes, seal inspections, system calibrations, inventory management. The tedium of keeping complex machinery operational fills much of every day. Long-duration spaceflight studies have documented the psychological toll of such conditions. Isolation leads to interpersonal conflict as minor irritations accumulate without relief. Monotony leads to depression and loss of motivation as the sameness of days blurs together. Sleep disturbances are common, disrupting circadian rhythms evolved for Earth's 24-hour cycle. Cognitive performance declines over extended missions, with crew members reporting difficulty concentrating and reduced problem-solving ability. The ISS experience provides concerning precedents. Station crews typically serve 6-month rotations, carefully selected for psychological compatibility, extensively trained in conflict resolution, supported by regular communication with family and mission control, buoyed by the knowledge that their return date is scheduled and certain. Even under these optimized conditions, interpersonal tensions develop. Crew members report irritation with colleagues' habits. Conflicts arise over resource allocation and task assignments. The station's psychological support infrastructure works constantly to maintain crew cohesion and morale. Lunar residents would face longer durations with fewer support mechanisms. Communication with Earth involves delays of 1 to 1.3 seconds each way, barely noticeable for simple exchanges, but sufficient to make natural conversation impossible. The rhythm of dialogue breaks down. You speak, then wait, then hear a response that feels disconnected from your words. This subtly disturbing latency would characterize every interaction with family, friends, and support personnel on Earth. Return to Earth would not be a scheduled certainty, but a complex, expensive operation that might be delayed or cancelled for reasons beyond the crew's control. The psychological anchor of a known end date would not exist. Residents would face an open-ended commitment with uncertain termination. The Biosphere 2 experience demonstrated how quickly psychological stress can degrade mission performance. The 8 researchers entered the sealed environment as colleagues united by shared scientific purpose. Within months, they had fractured into hostile camps. Communication broke down. Cooperation became sporadic and grudging. The social fabric that makes complex technical work possible tore apart under the pressure of confinement and stress. Mission performance suffered directly. Systems maintenance fell behind as interpersonal conflicts consumed time and emotional energy. The psychological collapse contributed to the technical failures. The two categories of failure fed on each other, each making the other worse in a descending spiral. Now, consider the interaction between psychological degradation and the maintenance requirements we have documented. Lunar habitat systems require continuous, careful attention. Seals must be inspected and replaced on schedule. Filters must be changed before breakthrough occurs. Equipment must be monitored for early signs of degradation. This work is repetitive, demanding, and absolutely critical. A missed inspection today becomes a leak next month. A delayed filter change allows contamination to build up. An unnoticed warning sign becomes a system failure. This maintenance work must be performed by crew members who are tired, who are stressed, who may be depressed or in conflict with their colleagues, who have been performing the same tasks in the same environment for months or years without relief. Under these conditions, errors become more likely. A seal not properly seated, a measurement not accurately recorded, a calibration skipped because the technician was distracted, a warning dismissed because the crew member checking it was exhausted and had seen many false alarms before. Studies of industrial accidents consistently identify human factors as major contributors. Workers who are fatigued make more errors. Workers who are stressed have reduced situational awareness. Workers who are in conflict with colleagues communicate poorly about safety-critical information. High-reliability organizations invest heavily in crew welfare, precisely because they understand that psychological state directly affects operational safety. A lunar habitat has severely limited ability to support crew welfare. There is nowhere to go for a vacation. The concept is meaningless when the only alternative to the habitat is death. There is no change of scenery available, no weekend trip to reset mental state, no visit from friends or family to provide emotional support. The crew is trapped together in a small space with no escape valve for the pressures that build. Some advocate crew rotation as a solution to psychological strain. Send fresh crew members periodically and return those who have completed their service. This approach transfers the psychological burden to many individuals in sequence, rather than concentrating it on a few for extended periods. But crew rotation has severe limitations. Every rotation requires transportation. A spacecraft must travel from Earth to the Moon, land, exchange crew, and either return to Earth or remain for the next rotation. At current and foreseeable costs, this transportation is extraordinarily expensive. Rotating crews annually might cost billions of dollars per rotation in launch, spacecraft, and operational expenses. There is also the training problem. Lunar habitat systems are unique. Each installation has its own equipment configurations, its own operational procedures, its own accumulated quirks and workarounds. New crew members require extensive training specific to their destination. They arrive as newcomers to a complex system that the departing crew understands intimately. The handoff between crews is a period of elevated risk. The arriving crew lacks the experience and intuition that the departing crew has developed. The departing crew may be mentally checked out, focused on their imminent return rather than on training their replacements. Critical institutional knowledge may fail to transfer. The alternative to rotation is long-duration crews, but this concentrates all the psychological challenges we have discussed. Crews who remain for years experience the full accumulation of stress, monotony, and interpersonal friction. Their maintenance performance degrades as their psychological state deteriorates. The feedback loop between human performance and system reliability becomes increasingly unfavorable. Some suggest that automation can reduce human burden and solve these problems. Advanced robotics and artificial intelligence could handle tedious maintenance while humans focus on oversight and exceptional situations. Automation is certainly part of any realistic lunar habitat design. Environmental monitoring, routine system adjustments, data logging, and many other functions can and should be automated. But automation faces fundamental limits that become apparent in the lunar environment. Automated systems fail. Sensors drift out of calibration. Actuators jam or wear. Software encounters conditions that its designers did not anticipate. Rather than eliminating maintenance requirements, automation shifts them. Instead of maintaining primary life support systems directly, the crew maintains the automated systems that maintain the primary systems. The closed loop now includes an additional layer of complexity. The lunar environment degrades automation faster than Earth conditions. Radiation damages electronic systems, causing bit flips in memory and degrading semiconductor performance. Dust infiltrates mechanisms, jamming actuators and contaminating sensors. Temperature cycling stresses components through repeated thermal expansion and contraction. The robots face the same degradation curves as every other system in the habitat. Automated systems cannot handle novelty as effectively as humans. A lunar habitat will encounter situations that were not anticipated during design. Unexpected combinations of failures, conditions outside design parameters, scenarios that require creative problem solving. Humans remain essential for adapting to the unexpected, for recognizing when automation is behaving incorrectly, for improvising solutions to problems that the designers never imagined. And automation cannot eliminate humans from the loop for a simple reason. Humans are the purpose of the habitat. A fully automated lunar facility with no human occupants is not a colony. It is a robotic outpost. The goal of habitation is human presence. That presence means humans must be there, participating in the closed loop, introducing all the variability and vulnerability that human presence entails. This brings us to cascade failures, which become increasingly likely as human performance degrades. Complex systems fail in cascades. One component failure stresses related components, which become more likely to fail, which stresses further components. The failures propagate through the system faster than repairs can contain them. What begins as a minor problem becomes a major crisis through a chain of connected degradations. On the Moon, cascades are particularly dangerous. Consider how a cascade might develop. A micrometeorite punctures the outer shell of a habitat module. The hole is small, perhaps 2 millimeters in diameter, but vacuum is unforgiving. Atmosphere begins escaping. The pressure management system detects the drop and increases output to compensate. Pumps work harder. Oxygen generation accelerates. The crew initiates breach protocol. They attempt to locate the puncture, working through a structured search pattern while the system maintains pressure. But the hole is in a difficult location, behind equipment that must be moved. The search takes longer than hoped. Meanwhile, one of the pressure management pumps, stressed by extended high-output operation, develops a bearing problem. Metal surfaces that should be separated by a film of lubricant begin making contact. The pump motor draws increased current. A thermal sensor detects rising temperature and triggers protective shutdown. Now the pressure management system is operating at reduced capacity. The remaining pumps work harder to compensate. The crew, still searching for the breach, must also respond to the pump alarm. Someone is pulled off the search to assess the pump situation. The atmospheric fluctuations begin affecting other systems. The oxygen generation process, designed for stable operating pressure, behaves erratically. As pressure varies, carbon dioxide removal efficiency drops. The air quality begins degrading. Crew members notice headaches, difficulty concentrating, the subtle cognitive fog that comes with elevated carbon dioxide. Under these conditions, stressed, time-pressured, cognitively impaired, the crew makes an error during the breach repair. The patch is applied incorrectly. It holds initially, but the seal is imperfect. Within weeks, the patch will fail again. This scenario is not implausible. Every element has precedent in operational experience. Micrometeorite impacts occur. Pumps fail under stress. Crew performance degrades under pressure. The individual events are manageable. The combination overwhelms available resources. Cascade failures become more likely as systems age. Fresh equipment operates within design parameters. Aged equipment operates at margins, with accumulated wear reducing tolerance for additional stress. A trigger that a new system would absorb without difficulty becomes a crisis for a degraded system. Cascade failures become more likely as crews tire. Alert, well-rested personnel catch warning signs early and respond effectively. Exhausted, stressed personnel miss warnings and respond slowly. The same triggering event produces different outcomes depending on crew state. After years of operation, with systems accumulated wear and crews accumulated fatigue, the probability of cascade failure rises continuously. The habitat becomes increasingly fragile, increasingly dependent on everything going right, increasingly vulnerable to the triggering event that initiates collapse. All of this still fails because humans are both the reason for the habitat and its ultimate limiting factor. Every system in a lunar habitat exists to sustain human life. The air recycling produces breathable atmosphere for human lungs. The water purification produces potable water for human consumption. The thermal control maintains temperatures for human comfort. The radiation shielding protects human tissue. Without humans, there is no purpose to any of it. But humans are also the most demanding components in the system. They consume oxygen, water, food, and power at rates determined by biology, not engineering convenience. They produce waste that must be processed. They require environmental conditions within narrow ranges that human physiology demands. They also make mistakes. They have conflicts that impair cooperation. They experience fatigue that degrades performance. They develop medical conditions that consume resources and demand attention. They are, in engineering terms, unreliable components, essential to system function, but prone to failure modes that cannot be designed away. A robotic lunar outpost could potentially operate for decades with minimal intervention. Machines can tolerate a wider range of conditions. Electronics can operate in vacuum. Robots do not need oxygen, water, or food. They do not experience psychological stress or interpersonal conflict. When they fail, the failure does not cascade into human tragedy. But a human habitat must meet human needs continuously, perfectly, for years or decades. Any interruption in life support is an emergency. Any degradation in environmental quality is a health risk. Any failure in critical systems is a potential catastrophe. The closed-loop life support systems exist to meet these needs. And these systems, as we have exhaustively documented, degrade faster than they can be sustainably maintained under lunar conditions. The human variable does not solve the closed-loop problem. It is the reason the closed-loop problem matters. It is why every discussion of lunar challenges ultimately collapses back into the same fundamental limitation. No matter how advanced our designs become, they still depend on closed-loop systems that cannot sustain themselves indefinitely while supporting the humans they exist to serve. The moon will be visited. It may host scientific outposts with rotating crews, serving limited tours, accepting the costs and risks of frequent transportation for the psychological and operational benefits of crew turnover. It may support resource extraction operations with workers who arrive, perform their assignments, and depart before the environment breaks them or their equipment. These are achievable goals, valuable goals, worth pursuing. But the moon will not become a permanent human home because the systems required to sustain human life cannot themselves be permanently sustained. The machines degrade, the humans degrade. The closed loop spirals inevitably toward failure. The mathematics of system degradation, the comparisons to what humanity has already attempted in hostile environments, the philosophical implications of accepting physical limits, All of these point toward the same inescapable conclusion. The Moon offers humanity many things. A home is not among them. In 1911, the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen became the first human to reach the South Pole. His expedition succeeded through meticulous planning, appropriate technology, and the certain knowledge that he could return home. Amundsen brought sled dogs, knowing they could be slaughtered for food during the return journey. He cached supplies along his route, creating a lifeline back to the coast. He calculated margins for error and weather delays. Every decision was made with one absolute priority: getting his team back alive. Amundsen never intended to stay at the pole. The triumph was in the reaching, not the residing. He planted a flag, took measurements, left a tent with a letter for his rival Robert Scott, and began the journey home. Within weeks, the Antarctic wind had buried every trace of his presence beneath drifting snow. More than a century later, Antarctica remains uninhabited in any permanent sense. This is not for lack of trying. Since the International Geophysical Year of 1957, nations have operated research stations across the frozen continent. McMurdo Station, operated by the United States, has grown from a handful of buildings to a complex capable of housing over 1,000 people during the austral summer. It has a power plant, water treatment facility, medical clinic, and workshops. It is connected to the outside world by aircraft and ships that arrive during the brief operational window when weather permits. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, has maintained Vostok Station near the geomagnetic South Pole since 1957. The station experiences some of the coldest temperatures ever recorded on Earth, -89.2 degrees Celsius in 1983. Researchers have drilled through kilometers of ice to reach Lake Vostok, an ancient body of water sealed beneath the ice sheet for millions of years. These are remarkable achievements. They represent decades of accumulated expertise in polar operations. They have produced invaluable scientific knowledge about Earth's climate history, its magnetic field, its atmospheric chemistry, and yet, no one is born in Antarctica. No one grows up there. The continent hosts rotating populations of scientists and support staff who serve tours measured in months or years, then return to the habitable world. Children do not play in Antarctic schoolyards. Families do not build lives across generations in Antarctic communities. The permanent population of Antarctica is 0. The reasons are instructive. Antarctic research stations require continuous resupply from temperate regions. They import food, fuel, equipment, spare parts, construction materials, medical supplies, and personnel. They export waste and exhausted workers. Despite 70 years of operation, despite billions of dollars in cumulative investment, despite technologies specifically developed for polar conditions, no Antarctic station is self-sufficient. Without the supply chain connecting them to global civilization, they would fail within months. McMurdo Station, the largest Antarctic installation, consumes millions of gallons of fuel per year. This fuel powers generators, heats buildings, and runs vehicles. Every gallon must be shipped from the United States, transported across the Southern Ocean, and offloaded during the narrow summer window when sea ice permits. If the ships stopped coming, McMurdo would go dark within a season. The station's food comes from the same supply chain. Fresh vegetables arrive by aircraft. Frozen and dry goods come by ship. The surrounding environment produces nothing edible. The continent's largest native land animal is a wingless midge, less than half an inch long. There is no hunting, no farming, no foraging. Every calorie consumed in Antarctica was produced elsewhere. Equipment fails in the extreme cold. Diesel engines require special modifications to start. Lubricants must be formulated for temperatures that would solidify ordinary oil. Metal becomes brittle. Plastics crack. The supply of spare parts and replacement equipment flows continuously from manufacturers in warmer climates. And this is Antarctica. a place where the air is breathable, where temperatures, while extreme, are survivable with appropriate clothing, where atmospheric pressure is normal, where radiation levels pose no special concern, where emergency evacuation is challenging but achievable. Now, consider what the Moon requires. Every challenge faced by Antarctic stations is present on the Moon, magnified by orders of magnitude. The temperature extremes are greater. Antarctica's record low is negative 89 degrees Celsius. The lunar night reaches negative 173 degrees. Antarctica's summer temperatures can climb above freezing. The lunar day reaches 127 degrees. The thermal swing that Antarctic equipment must survive is roughly 100 degrees Celsius. The lunar swing is 300 degrees. The pressure differential is total. Antarctic stations maintain normal atmospheric pressure against normal atmospheric pressure. There is no pressure stress on structures, no need for airtight seals, no catastrophic consequence if a window cracks. A lunar habitat maintains 1 atmosphere against 0. Every square meter of external surface bears 10 tons of outward force. A cracked window is not a repair inconvenience. It is a life-threatening emergency. The radiation is unshielded. Antarctica lies beneath the same atmosphere and magnetic field that protects the rest of Earth. Researchers receive normal background radiation doses. A lunar habitat exposes its occupants to continuous cosmic radiation and periodic solar particle events at levels that cause cumulative biological damage. The resupply distances are vastly longer. Ships reach McMurdo in days from New Zealand. Aircraft can arrive in hours for true emergencies. The Moon is 3 days away under optimal conditions, weeks or months away in practice when launch windows, spacecraft availability, and payload preparation are considered. The evacuation options are minimal. An injured or ill Antarctic researcher can be flown to Christchurch for advanced medical care. The journey is difficult but achievable. An injured or ill lunar resident must wait for a spacecraft, survive a 3-day transit, endure re-entry deceleration, and hope the injury is survivable with available care during this extended timeline. For many emergencies, it is not. If we cannot achieve self-sufficient permanent habitation in Antarctica after 70 years of continuous operation, what makes us think we can achieve it on the Moon? The answer, usually unspoken but always implicit, is faith in future technology. We assume that advances in material science will produce seals that do not degrade, filters that do not clog, mechanisms that do not wear. We assume that robotics and artificial intelligence will reduce maintenance requirements to negligible levels. We assume that in situ resource utilization will provide local supplies of everything a habitat needs. We assume that biotechnology will create closed-loop agricultural systems that recycle waste into food with perfect efficiency. Perhaps these assumptions will prove correct. Perhaps technologies that seem speculative today will become routine tomorrow. The history of technology includes many examples of problems that seemed impossible until someone solved them. But faith in future technology fails to grapple with a fundamental issue. Some problems are not technological. They are thermodynamic. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy in a closed system always increases. Disorder grows. Organization decays. Complex structures break down into simpler ones. This is not a technological limitation. It is a law of physics, as fundamental as the conservation of energy, as inviolable as the speed of light. A lunar habitat is, for practical purposes, a closed system. Energy enters from solar collectors or nuclear reactors. Some mass enters through resupply, but the system is far more closed than any environment humans normally inhabit. On Earth, we draw continuously on the planet's accumulated resources, its atmosphere, its water cycle, its biosphere, its mineral deposits. We externalize entropy by discarding waste into an environment large enough to absorb it. The loop is never truly closed because the planet is vast and our activities, until recently, was small relative to its capacity. On the Moon, the loop closes tight. Resources are limited to what you brought, and what you can extract with equipment that itself requires resources to maintain. Waste cannot be externalized into a vast absorbing environment. It must be processed, stored, or recycled within the system. Every inefficiency accumulates. Every loss compounds. In closed systems, entropy wins. Not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably. Every mechanical system in the habitat trends toward disorder. Seals degrade as polymer chains break and recombine in less organized configurations. Filters clog as they accumulate the very particles they are designed to remove. Catalysts poison as contaminants bind to active sites. Bearings wear as metal surfaces abrade against each other. Electronics fail as radiation damages semiconductor structures. These processes cannot be prevented. They can only be managed, and managing them requires energy, materials, and skilled labor, all of which have their own entropic costs. To maintain a complex system against entropy requires continuous input of low-entropy resources from outside the system, fresh materials, new components, replacement systems. The entropy you export through maintenance must be replaced by the entropy you import through resupply. On Earth, this exchange is invisible because it is so easy. A broken pump is replaced with a new pump manufactured in a factory that draws on global supply chains for materials, components, energy, and expertise. The entropy of the broken pump is exported. The low entropy of the new pump is imported. The factory itself eventually wears out and is replaced by a new factory. The supply chains evolve and adapt. The entire industrial civilization sustains itself through continuous renewal, drawing on the planet's accumulated resources and the sun's continuous energy input. On the Moon, low-entropy resources are scarce. Solar energy is abundant during the 2-week lunar day. Energy storage sufficient to bridge this gap requires enormous mass and introduces its own degradation modes. Battery capacity fades with charge cycles. Fuel cells consume reactants. Flywheels lose energy to friction. The energy storage system itself requires maintenance. Raw materials exist in the lunar regolith. Oxygen is bound in mineral oxides. Aluminum, iron, titanium, and silicon are present in varying concentrations. But extracting and refining these materials requires industrial processes that themselves need equipment, energy, and consumables. The extraction equipment wears. The refining systems corrode. The energy to run them must be generated and stored. Each step in the process introduces entropy that must be managed. There is no biosphere on the Moon, no accumulated chemical energy in fossil fuels, no complex organic molecules built up over billions of years of biological activity. No nitrogen cycle, no carbon cycle, no water cycle except what humans create artificially. Every resource loop must be constructed from scratch and maintained against degradation. Technology can improve efficiency. Better solar panels extract more energy per kilogram of installed mass. Better recycling systems recover a higher percentage of consumed materials. Better manufacturing processes require fewer inputs and produce less waste. These improvements are real and valuable, but technology cannot change thermodynamics. Efficiency can approach 100% but never reach it. Losses accumulate. The closed loop bleeds entropy continuously, and that entropy must be replaced from somewhere. Let us put numbers to this abstraction. The International Space Station has a design life of 30 years, though it has been extended through continuous maintenance and component replacement. During its operational lifetime, the ISS has required thousands of tons of resupply mass replacement parts. Consumables, equipment upgrades, food, water, atmospheric gases, and crew rotation. The station could not have survived a single year without this continuous replenishment, and the ISS operates in an environment far less hostile than the lunar surface. It faces vacuum and radiation, but its orbit avoids the worst of the Van Allen belts. It experiences thermal cycling, but within a range of tens of degrees, not hundreds. It has no dust infiltration problem. It does not experience the mechanical stresses of landing, surface operations, and launch. A lunar habitat must achieve lower maintenance requirements than the ISS because resupply is more difficult. But a lunar habitat also faces more hostile conditions than the ISS. The degradation rates are likely higher, not lower. The engineering challenge is to reduce maintenance requirements while simultaneously increasing environmental stress. Optimistic projections for lunar habitats suggest maintenance closure rates, the fraction of maintenance that can be handled locally without Earth, resupply of perhaps 90 to 95%. This would be an extraordinary engineering achievement, far beyond anything demonstrated in operational space systems to date. But even at 95% closure, 5% of maintenance requirements must come from Earth. For a habitat with ISS-level complexity and maintenance needs, this represents substantial ongoing resupply. Over decades, it represents enormous cumulative mass, thousands of tons of materials that must be manufactured on Earth, launched into space, transported to the Moon, and integrated into habitat systems. And 95% closure is optimistic. Current closed-loop life support systems achieve much lower rates. The ISS recovers approximately 90% of water and generates oxygen through electrolysis, but requires continuous resupply of food, spare parts, and many consumables. The closure rate for overall mass is perhaps 50 to 60%. Some argue that closure rates can reach 100% through advanced manufacturing and complete resource utilization, that the lunar habitat can become truly independent of Earth, producing everything it needs from local materials using locally maintained equipment. This argument fails for reasons we have examined throughout this discussion. Manufacturing systems are themselves complex systems that degrade according to the same thermodynamic principles as everything else. A three-dimensional printer that produces replacement parts also requires replacement parts, print heads that wear, build platforms that warp, feedstock mechanisms that jam. A chemical refinery that extracts metals from regolith also corrodes, clogs, and wears. The machinery that maintains the machinery requires its own maintenance. Each layer of self-sufficiency demands its own support infrastructure, and every layer bleeds entropy. You cannot bootstrap your way out of the second law of thermodynamics. Even on Earth, with access to global supply chains and billions of humans specializing in countless trades, true manufacturing closure is impossible. No factory produces everything it needs to sustain itself. Every factory depends on inputs from elsewhere. Raw materials, specialized components, skilled labor, energy, expertise. The industrial ecosystem is a web of interdependencies, spanning the planet, refined over centuries of accumulated development. A lunar habitat cannot replicate this ecosystem. It cannot contain the thousands of specialized processes required to manufacture modern equipment from raw materials. It cannot train its small crew in the hundreds of distinct disciplines that industrial civilization requires. It cannot maintain the institutional knowledge that resides in the minds of millions of engineers, scientists, technicians, and craftspeople distributed across Earth. The habitat will always depend on Earth for something. Specialized materials that cannot be synthesized locally. Precision components that exceed local manufacturing capability. Expert consultation for problems beyond local knowledge. Software updates for systems too complex to maintain independently. Medical interventions for conditions beyond local treatment capability. That dependence means the habitat is not truly permanent. It exists at Earth's pleasure, sustained by Earth's resources, vulnerable to Earth's disruptions. If the supply chain from Earth is interrupted by economic crisis, by political change, by war, by simple loss of interest in funding expensive lunar operations, the habitat enters terminal decline. This brings us back to the real problem that makes permanent lunar habitation impossible. No matter how advanced our designs become, they still depend on closed-loop systems that cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. The mathematics of reliability do not favor long timescales. Consider a habitat with 100 critical systems, each with 99% probability of surviving a given year without catastrophic failure. The probability that all 100 systems survive the year is approximately 37%. Increase individual system reliability to 99.9%. Now, the probability that all systems survive a year is approximately 90%. Better, but still alarming for permanent habitation. Over 10 years, the probability drops to approximately 35%. Redundancy helps. If critical systems have backups, single failures do not cause catastrophe. But redundancy multiplies complexity. More systems means more potential failure points. The backup systems themselves require maintenance. The interfaces between primary and backup systems introduce their own failure modes. Design practices that make systems more independent help. Modular construction, standardized interfaces, graceful degradation. These approaches extend operational lifetime, but they do not change the fundamental mathematics. Given enough time, every system fails. Given enough failures, some cannot be repaired with available resources. Given enough unrepaired failures, the habitat becomes uninhabitable. This is not pessimism. It is actuarial mathematics, the same analysis that insurance companies use to price policies, that safety engineers use to design redundancy, that aerospace companies use to plan maintenance schedules. Apply this analysis honestly to lunar habitation, and the conclusion is unavoidable. Permanent self-sustaining habitation has a probability approaching zero over timescales relevant to human civilization. Let me address the counter-arguments directly. Some argue that humanity's long-term survival requires becoming multiplanetary, that we must accept the risks of space habitation because remaining solely on Earth exposes us to extinction. Risks, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, pandemic diseases, nuclear war, runaway artificial intelligence, climate catastrophe. This argument has merit as motivation for space exploration. Putting eggs in multiple baskets is a reasonable risk management strategy. When the stakes are species survival, but it does not change the engineering reality we have documented. The moon's habitability is not a function of our desire to survive. It is a function of physics, chemistry, and materials science. No amount of existential motivation makes closed-loop systems more robust. No threat to Earth makes lunar seals more durable, or lunar radiation less damaging, or lunar dust less abrasive. If long-term survival is the goal, the engineering resources directed toward permanent lunar habitation might be more effectively spent elsewhere. Building asteroid detection and deflection systems addresses one extinction risk directly. Developing technologies to survive volcanic winters addresses another. Creating robust, distributed infrastructure that can survive civilization-level disruptions addresses several more. These investments reduce Earthbound extinction risk without requiring solutions to problems that may be unsolvable. The moon is not a lifeboat. A lifeboat must be simpler than the ship it serves, able to function when the ship cannot. A lunar colony would be vastly more complex than Earth-based civilization, requiring constant support from that civilization to survive. In a scenario where Earth is devastated to the point where it cannot sustain a lunar colony, the colony would not save humanity. It would simply add additional casualties to the disaster. Some argue that future technology will solve problems we cannot currently solve. Nanotechnology will build self-repairing systems. Artificial general intelligence will manage complexity beyond human capability. Advanced materials will resist degradation indefinitely. Fusion power will provide unlimited energy. Biotechnology will create perfect recycling. Perhaps. These technologies might emerge. Some might even prove applicable to the specific challenges of lunar habitation. But planning based on technologies that do not yet exist is not engineering. It is faith. Meanwhile, the problems of closed-loop habitation are immediate and concrete. We know that seals degrade. We know that filters clog. We know that contamination accumulates. We know that humans make errors under stress. We know that complex systems fail in cascades. These are not theoretical concerns, awaiting technological solutions. They are observed phenomena documented across decades of space operations. Betting human lives on technologies that may never materialize is not bold, it is irresponsible. And even future technologies face thermodynamic limits. Nanotechnology cannot violate the second law. Self-repairing systems still require energy and materials. AI cannot prevent metal fatigue or radiation damage. Fusion power, if achieved, still requires containment vessels that corrode and control systems that fail. The problems are not primarily computational or energetic. They are about the inherent limitations of physical systems operating in hostile environments over extended periods. Some argue that economic incentives will drive solutions. Lunar mining could produce valuable materials. Space tourism could generate revenue. Commercial activities could fund the development of increasingly robust habitation systems, iterating towards sustainability through market pressure. This confuses incentive with capability. Economic motivation can accelerate technology development when solutions are physically possible. It cannot make impossible solutions possible. No business model changes the physics of thermal cycling, or the chemistry of contamination, accumulation, or the mathematics of system reliability. Moreover, economic activities on the Moon do not require permanent habitation. Mining operations can use rotating crews, like offshore oil platforms. Workers arrive, serve their assignments, and depart before the environment damages them or their equipment beyond recovery. Tourism can involve short visits a few days on the surface, then return to Earth with stories and photographs. So what is the Moon good for? Scientific research, certainly. The lunar far side, shielded from Earth's radio noise, offers an unparalleled platform for radio astronomy. Telescopes there could detect signals too faint to observe from Earth. The permanently shadowed craters may contain ice deposits that preserve records of the early solar system's chemistry, cometary materials, solar wind particles, organic molecules delivered by impacts over billions of years. The lunar surface itself, undisturbed by atmosphere or water, preserves geological history that Earth's active crust has long since erased. Resource extraction may prove valuable. Water ice in polar craters could be processed into rocket fuel, enabling operations throughout the inner solar system. Helium-3, if fusion power ever becomes practical, exists in lunar regolith and might justify extraction. Rare metals could supplement Earth's supplies, though the economics remain speculative. Technological development benefits from lunar operations. The challenges of working on the Moon, managing closed-loop systems, operating in radiation environments, maintaining equipment in thermal extremes, advanced capabilities applicable throughout the solar system. Even partial solutions teach valuable lessons. All of these applications are compatible with a lunar presence that is not permanent habitation. Rotating crews serve tours and return to Earth. Robotic systems handle routine operations. Humans visit when their presence adds value and depart when their tours are complete. The Moon becomes a workplace, not a home. This is not failure. This is appropriate use of a resource. The Antarctic analogy illuminates this reframing. We do not view our inability to colonize Antarctica as a defeat. We do not lament that no children are born at McMurdo Station or that no families build multi-generational lives at the South Pole. We view Antarctica as a special place, valuable for science and worthy of protection, where humans can visit but not settle. This framing allows us to benefit from Antarctica without demanding that it become something it cannot be. The Moon can occupy a similar conceptual space, a destination rather than a home, a frontier rather than a settlement, a challenge that teaches us about our capabilities and our limits. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson. Humanity has been remarkably successful at expanding into new environments. From our origins in East Africa, we have spread to every continent. We have built cities in deserts where rain never falls, in jungles where disease decimates the unprepared, in mountains where the air is thin and cold, in Arctic regions where darkness lasts for months. We have developed technologies that allow survival in conditions that would kill an unaugmented human within minutes. But this expansion has occurred within the envelope of Earth's biosphere. Even our most extreme environments share fundamental characteristics. The air is breathable, or can be made so with filtration. Water exists, or can be obtained from ice or imported. Temperatures, while extreme, are survivable with appropriate shelter and clothing. The pressure is Earth normal. The radiation is Earth normal. The gravity is Earth normal. We have extended the boundaries of human habitation, but we have not escaped them. We remain creatures of Earth, adapted to Earth's conditions, dependent on Earth's resources. The Moon represents a different kind of challenge. Not extending the boundaries of habitation, but attempting to establish habitation where none is naturally possible. No breathable air to filter, no liquid water to collect, no temperatures that allow survival without constant active intervention, no pressure except what you create and maintain, no shielding except what you build and sustain. This is orders of magnitude more difficult than anything humanity has previously achieved. The difference is not merely quantitative, but qualitative. We are not adapting to a challenging environment. We are creating an environment from nothing and maintaining it against relentless entropic decay. Recognizing this difference is not admitting defeat, it is understanding the actual nature of the challenge. And that understanding should shape our ambitions, our investments, and our expectations. Permanent human presence beyond Earth is not impossible in principle, but it requires environments more amenable to closed-loop habitation than the Moon provides. Rotating space stations that can be constructed and maintained at reasonable cost. Locations with accessible resources and moderate environmental challenges. Perhaps Mars, which offers at least some atmospheric protection, more accessible water ice, and a day-night cycle closer to human circadian rhythms. Perhaps orbital habitats constructed from asteroid materials, designed from the beginning for permanent occupation. The Moon is a stepping stone, not a destination. A place to develop technologies and test capabilities. A resource to exploit, and a scientific frontier to explore. A laboratory for learning how humans and machines perform in deep space. But not a home. Accepting this limit is not a failure of ambition. It is a maturation of understanding. Humanity's future in space will be determined by what is physically possible, not by what we wish were possible. And physical possibility has boundaries that no amount of enthusiasm can move. Every closed-loop system eventually collapses. Every hostile environment eventually defeats the systems designed to survive it. Every human habitat eventually reaches the end of its maintainable lifetime. On Earth, we rebuild elsewhere. Cities rise and fall, but civilization continues. Structures decay and are replaced. The biosphere provides a foundation that sustains us through every failure of our constructed systems. When buildings collapse, we have the ground. When machines fail, we have our hands. When technology fails completely, we can survive as our ancestors did, on what the Earth provides. On the Moon, there is no elsewhere. There is no ground to stand on when the habitat fails, only vacuum. There are no hands capable of survival when the machines stop, only bodies that require those machines to live. There is no ancestral fallback, no pre-technological survival mode, No option except the functioning of systems that cannot function forever. The moon will be visited, explored, exploited, and studied. Humans will walk its surface again, perhaps within this decade. They will stay for days, then weeks, perhaps eventually months. They will conduct experiments, collect samples, test equipment, and learn enormous amounts about operating in deep space. Then, they will leave. They will return to the planet, where closed-loop systems are unnecessary because the loop is not closed, where a failing filter can be replaced, not with another filter from diminishing stores, but with a new filter from an industrial civilization that produces millions of filters every year, where a leaking seal does not mean death because the air outside is breathable, where a power failure is an inconvenience, not a countdown to suffocation. They will return to the planet where humans evolved and where, despite all our dreams of cosmic expansion, we remain suited to live. The moon will never be a human home. This is not tragedy. It is reality. And reality, properly understood, is the only foundation on which genuine progress can be built. The dreams that fail to account for reality are not ambitions, they are fantasies. The plans that ignore physical limits are not bold. They are irresponsible. The resources poured into impossible goals are resources diverted from achievable ones. Our species has one confirmed habitable world. Protecting and sustaining that world is not a retreat from space. It is the prerequisite for any genuine expansion beyond Earth. A civilization that cannot maintain its home planet cannot maintain a lunar colony. A species that exhausts its birth world will not find salvation on a barren moon. The moon watches over us in the night sky, as it has since before humanity existed. It will continue watching, beautiful and barren, while generations of humans gaze upward and wonder what it would be like to live there. They will never find out. The seals will fail. The filters will clog, the air will poison, the water will foul. The systems will cascade into failure one after another, and the closed loop will collapse. Not because engineers were careless, not because technology failed to advance, but because entropy is patient, and the moon is hostile, and human systems cannot sustain themselves forever against both. In that inevitable collapse lies a lesson about limits, about the difference between what we wish to achieve and what physics allows us to achieve, about the hubris of assuming that wanting something badly enough makes it possible. It is a hard lesson, but it is a true one. The moon will never be a human home. And knowing this, finally accepting it, we can begin to think clearly about what the moon actually can be, and what we can genuinely become in the cosmos we inhabit.